Let's take our Bibles, go to Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1. Last week we covered the first two here, 2 days of creation. And so we will pick up with day 3. There we go, day 3. Verse number 9 down through verse number 13, we'll read them together real quick, and then we'll jump into this. But it says in verse number 9, and God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place. Let the dry land appear," and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas, and God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, let the herb yielding seed, and the fruit yielding fruit after its kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, and herb yielding seed after its kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after its kind. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the third day. So we come up here on the third day. And so God's done a couple of things here, right? So day 1, we have the creation of light. On day number 1, and depending on where you fall, you've got some discussion to be had about whether that's the day on which the actual globe part of the earth is created. So I think I don't think there's a problem with believing that the globe was created on day 1. I think it probably pre-existed day 1 based on the fact that it was without form and void. No other part of God's creation does he create that way. And a lot of the things that you see in the course of chapter 1 is actually God revealing, or uncovering versus creating. So there's something to be said for that. But anyway, so all of that, you've got on day 1 the creation, at least, of light, and then the bringing forth of the firmament takes place on day number 2. You've got the creation of the atmosphere and defining the atmosphere between defining the firmaments, right? And so as we discussed last week, there's multiple atmospheres even on the face of the planet, right? Every time that you go sky, or if you go deep sea diving, I want to say it's every 50 or every 100 feet is what they call an atmosphere. And so the same thing is true going up, versus going down. And so we live in an atmosphere. There's an atmosphere above our atmosphere, which is and then obviously there's an atmosphere that we can't see or experience, right? So with all of that said, you've got the atmosphere being defined here, and the way that it's defined is as basically the earth between them. The earth is between these atmospheres, right? And so then you come into day number 3, and you've got the creation of land, sea, and plants taking place on day number 3. And so day number 3 starts with God gathering the waters together. In verse number 9 there, he says he gathered the waters. And God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear," and it was so. So the land was there. God didn't create dry land on that day. He simply brought it forth, He gathered the waters together into certain places, into a singular place in this case. He gathers water together into a singular place. If you've ever seen your globe, or you've ever seen a map, you know that the map basically fits together. It was one big landmass at one point in time, which is broken and drifted apart. And basically every scientist agrees that that's what happened. They don't all agree that it happened because of the flood, but even though that is in literally every historical tradition, there is a story of a worldwide flood. And so they find it all the time. When they're doing archaeological digs and stuff like that, they find this historical narrative of a flood somewhere in the history of the people that they're studying. And so But so God gathers all the waters together. He gathers them all together into one place, right? It says the waters under the heaven, right? So what is God saying? He's saying that there was water under the atmosphere, right? That was considered to be the heavens, and there was water over that atmosphere, which would basically make the earth, for lack of a better way of putting it, make it a hyperbolic chamber, right? And so similar to a greenhouse, but hyperbolic is a little bit different. There's very high levels of oxygen in a hyperbolic chamber, which would make sense, right? Since water is what? Hydrogen, right? H2O, right? And so high levels of oxygen. There's high levels of oxygen in a hyperbolic chamber, and that actually the studies show, right, that it doesn't stop you from aging, but it certainly slows the aging process down. The problem is you can't live in a hyperbolic chamber your whole life, right? And so because you can't, there's really no way to study out the effects that it would have long term, right? How long you would live if you were to only exist and right, only ate foods and everything else that came from inside of a hyperbolic chamber, right? You got to remember the plants were inside that hyperbolic chamber. All of the animals are inside that hyperbolic chamber, right? Everything is in this hyperbolic chamber, so everything would have been different, right? Which is one of the reasons that when they talk about dinosaurs, right, and they come up with I'm with them when they find entire skeletons of dinosaurs, but most often they build these models off of a bone, right? And I'm not saying scientists aren't smart and they can't figure some things out about what a dinosaur would have looked like, but I think most of the picture, the illustration that we see of dinosaurs is probably not very accurate, honestly. I think dinosaurs looked a lot more like most of the lizards that you see, but if you put a lizard in a hyperbolic chamber, we already know that lizards will grow to their environment, but imagine then on top of them growing to meet their environment, they lived in a hyperbolic chamber where they continued to grow for a countless number of years. I bet they'd be really big, right? And so if you did that, you certainly would end up with some very large lizards, which you might even refer to as dinosaurs. Right? And so I'm not saying that every depiction of a dinosaur is false, I'm just saying not all of them are realistic either, right? So that tells you that there was a division between these waters, right? There was water in heaven, there was water under heaven, right? And the water that was under heaven was covering something, was covering this land mass. And when God gathers all the water into one place, the land mass of the earth is revealed by that. It's not created by it. It wasn't created, it was revealed, right? So much of what you actually find here in the discussion about creation is revelation versus creation, right? Not that I would say there was a singular act of creation, but there's less creation in Genesis chapter 1 than most of us give credit for, right? Most of us say, and on this day God created this, and on that day God created this, and on that day God created this. But that's not the way the story goes. The story actually, it sounds a lot more like on this day God revealed this, on this day God revealed that, right? It's more bringing forth than it is creating. So anyways, he gathers it all into one place. So what does that tell you? It tells you that prior to the flood, there was one main body of water, right? Genesis chapter 2 speaks about a river flowing out of Eden, and then it divides into 4 different tributaries, right? And so God had this ecosystem in place where all water on the face of the planet was in connection to each other. It was one body. Right? So that's very different than the world that we live in today, right? Even though most of the body of water, even on the face of our planet today, most of it is connected still, right? In one way or another. There are lakes, but even lakes, most of them are fed by underground rivers that are in some way connected to your oceans. And all of your oceans and seas pretty much are connected to one another as well. There's a reason why the Dead Sea is referred to as the Dead Sea. There's nothing coming in and nothing going out. That is different than, right, what you see in most other places on the face of the planet. So I'm not saying that all bodies of water are still connected to one another, but most of them still are, which is basically a reflection of the way that things would have been originally. Originally, there was one main river that split off into 4 tributaries, right? And all of the water on the face of the planet was connected to one another and would have been considered one body of water. And so God had a good plan going, but like most plans, right? Man messed it up. So you see the revealing. We see the revealing of the land here, right? In verse number 9, the waters are gathered together, and dry land appears, right? It says, "Let the dry land appear," he says there, and let dry land appear, right? And so up until that point, the entire earth was covered by water. And so by God gathering all that water into one place, it allowed the dry land to appear out of it, right? And so the word dry land in verse 1 is elsewhere translated as earth, right? So that would imply, right? Could certainly imply at least that there were some topographical changes that took place as well, because it's dry land that appears, right? Versus, so God gathers all the water into one place, and in doing so, dry land appears out of that. So before that, what you would have been looking at was an entire world that was covered in water. Let me ask you a question, right? We have a lot of discussion in science about the Ice Age and all that kind of stuff, right? If the entire world was covered in water and you don't have any heat or light until verse 1, until after verse 1, right? Verse 2 is when things start to happen. There was no heat and no light. What happens to water with no heat and no light? Turns to what? Turns to ice, right? So maybe, right? Maybe the Ice Age is legitimate, just not legitimate in the way that they think it is, right? And so the world would have been covered. This is just speculation, right? And this is just my opinion, but I think it's well founded that what you end up with in chapter 1, right? An earth that is without form and void is a big globe of ice that is not necessarily a perfect circle by any stretch of the imagination, right? The water maybe, right, the way that it maybe froze in place would have made it, if you've ever seen water that has just frozen in an instant, that's been quickly frozen, right? You throw water into the air and it quickly freezes, right? You wouldn't have an ice cube, you wouldn't have any form to it, right? It would be without form. And so that's more than likely what the planet looked like before God shows up, introduces light and heat, things melt. Now the globe is covered in water, right? I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on there. So sometimes we just outright deny science, right? In some cases. And we say, well, the Ice Age couldn't possibly have ever happened. No, it's not that the Ice Age couldn't possibly have ever happened. It certainly could have happened. Probably the Ice Age would have been what predated our creation. Right? And so what they're seeing is they are seeing the ice and they're seeing that history, right, on the face of the planet of there having been an Ice Age, which would have been accurate. So anyways, if this certainly could imply, obviously, that there was some topographical changes to the land as well, right? For all we know, the world started out as just one big plain, And when God gathers the water into one place, right, he reforms some of that topography. Though I don't think that mountains as we know them now, I don't think that they necessarily existed really before Noah shows up on the scene. Right? When the world breaks up, I think that's where you get mountains from. You're getting, because most mountains are two plates that have been slammed together, broken off, and pushed up into the air. And so that's what most mountains are. And I think that there was probably peaks and valleys in Noah's day, without a doubt, but they wouldn't have been like we see peaks and valleys, right? We see these jagged peaks. I think they would have looked a lot more like a rolling landscape, right? So anyways, then we come into verse number 10 there. In verse number 10, and God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas, and God saw that it was good. So in verse number 10, he names the land and the waters, right? He calls dry land earth. He calls the waters that are gathered together seas. And then he says about them that they're good. And so God's creation is a good thing, right? And it's not until man shows up on the scene that there's any problems really with God's creation. So a lot of times we complain about nature when the reality is nature is doing a pretty good job. Right? Most of the problem is us. In fact, we're such a problem that we could exist without all of the stuff that we exist with. Right? It's only, you got to think about it, right? The only reason that we have a water shortage is what? Is it because we drink too much water? Or is it because we bathe too much? No, it's because we've got it pumping all over the place, right? We pump water from here to there, right? We make concrete out of it, you know? You got to think, right? God has to sit in heaven and just think that we're hilarious sometimes, right? God says, look at that. I give them stones, and you know what they do? They make their own because they're so smart, right? And so, listen, all the old structures like in Europe, Greece, Italy, right? They're all made out of stone. That's what they're made out of. They're all made out of stone that was cut and fashioned, and they still stand. You know what concrete does? Falls down, right? Concrete don't last forever. It disintegrates, but stone doesn't, right? You can wear stone down, but you can't make it go away, right? So man's come up with them, right? We use it for that. We use it so that we can water crops that we then take to a grocery store to sell to our citizens, and then you know what we do with about probably 60% of it? We discard it. We throw it away. Most of that produce goes right in the trash. If you've ever been in the back of a grocery store, they have an entire room back there for it. And you know what they're not allowed to do with it? They're not allowed to give it away. Because what will happen is, and you'll take it home, you'll eat it, you'll get sick, you'll blame it on them, tell them that they gave you E. coli, right? Sue them for millions of dollars. And so, right, so they can't even give it away to the homeless people. But listen, we do it we're crazy, right? If we went back, right, and I know this is never going to happen, but if we went back to hunter-gatherer, right, this planet has absolutely everything man needs. The problem is not that there is not enough resources. It's that man does a horrible job of allocating resources. And we use a lot of the resources for nothing, right? So God says what? God says this is all good, right? The earth, the firmament, right? The firmament and the actual land mass that God brought forth, God says about it all that it was good. It's a good thing. It tells you a couple of things, right? Sometimes we knee-jerk react to environmentalists, right? And right, they say, well, you guys are ruining the planet. You guys, we shouldn't use plastics and all this stuff, And so us being, right, fiercely independent as Americans, and we overreact to that, and we're like, yeah, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to buy plastic bags just to throw away. right? Listen, we have a responsibility still, right? As God's people, we do have a responsibility still to maintain what God called good. We should not treat the earth in poor ways. I'm not saying we should all be tree huggers, because I don't think that that's helping anybody out, right? The resources are here to be used, but you also have to admit we're not using the resources well. Overall, we are not using the resources well. Even most of the gas on the face of this planet is not used for good purposes, right? We use most of the fuel on the face of this planet to produce things that aren't really great things all the time, right? So, listen, we have a responsibility to use the resources on the planet well and to do right by the resources that we have. And as believers, we should be, I'm not telling you should divide your garbage up, because I've been to the dump, and I'm telling you right now, they don't divide it up. It's all going to the same place, right? They can tell you whatever they want. It's just a way to charge you for an extra garbage can, basically, right? It makes the environmentalists feel like they did something, and it lets basically the garbage companies in the state collect a couple of extra bucks. So it's a win-win. Lose for you, but it's a win-win for the state and the environmentalists, basically, right? So I'm not telling you that, but I am saying, right, that we shouldn't treat the earth in ways that are poor. We should not, right, throw things out, and we should discard things properly, right? That kind of stuff. We should be concerned about the way that the planet is treated, right? You don't have to become an environmentalist. You don't have to go stand down in front of the UN, right, and hold signs about global warming, because I think it's all bunk, right? I'll tell you this, the planet's going to get hot one day. It's going to get real hot, according to Revelation. Right? So I'm not on board with global warming and all that other kind of stuff. I'm not saying that some of it, that there's not some science behind some of it, just saying that there is competing science, right? So you've got to have a balanced view of it. And maybe the globe is incrementally warming, but I don't think it's something to be alarmed about in the way that they want to alarm you. Listen, all you got to do in any case is always just follow the money, right? But we should do right by God's creation, nonetheless. So God says to Job in Job chapter 38, you can turn there if you want to. I'm going to read a couple of verses here from Job chapter 38, verse 4 down through verse 11. When Job's complaining at God, God says this to Job. He says, where wast thou when I laid the foundation of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measure thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut up the sea with doors, when it brake forth as if it had been out of the womb? When I made the cloud the garment thereof, and thick darkness a swaddling band for it, and break up for it my decreed place, and set bars and doors, and said, hitherto shalt thou come, but no further, and here shall thy proud waves be stayed. Right? So God tells Job a bunch of stuff in this passage, but he tells Job, where were you when I was laying the foundations of the world? He says, and if you were there, he says, how big is it? All right? He said, if you stretched a measuring tape on it, you know how big it is? He says, tell me how big it is. How big was it when I laid it out? All right? Is what he tells him. Then he says this, I think this is an interesting thing. He says, whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? He says, what is the world, what's it all connected to? All right? He says, if you know so much, he says, you tell me what it's fastened to. And so we say the world is what? We say it's not fastened to anything, right? Say it's floating around out in outer space. But God says it's not, it doesn't say that. God says it's fashioned. He says it's fastened to something. Right? Now, it's not fastened to what the Romans and some of the Greeks used to think, right? That it was sitting on the back of a giant elephant that was standing on the back of a giant turtle. I don't think that's probably accurate. Right? So now, I've never been to outer space, neither of you, so you don't know. Could be a giant elephant out there. Right? We could be living in a real live version of Horton Hears a Who. Yeah. You know? So there's certainly, I mean, who knows, right? We could be what's in Horton Hears a Who, what they're a speck on a leaf or something like that, or a flower. That's what it is. They're a speck on a flower, and Horton carries that flower around trying to save those people. Right? For all we know, that's right the way that it is. Of course, there's very little likelihood of that based on what Scripture has to say. In fact, he says that he hung it on nothing. But that doesn't mean it's not fastened to something, right? So God's got it fastened into place. And so he says, where's it fastened? He says, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy, right? He says, or who laid the cornerstone thereof? That's an interesting statement from God, right? In relation to the earth. There's a reason that there's pyramids all over the place. We talk about cornerstones, right? We talk about cornerstones, but we don't think of them in the way that that a cornerstone is actually meant, right? We think of them as being the foundational corner of a building, but that's not what a cornerstone is. Cornerstone is the tippy top of a pyramid, and that cornerstone is the first piece of the pyramid, and everything is put under that cornerstone. And that cornerstone basically goes up, right, is built up into the air off of everything else that's below it is built off of that cornerstone. And so when God says that he laid the cornerstone on the world, right, it's an interesting statement at the very least, wouldn't you think? What if, maybe the landmass that from that time, right, was very different than we think that it was, right? So, anyways, give you some food for thought, right? So he says, the morning stars sang together, all the sons of God shouted for joy. He says, or who hath shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth as if it had issued out of the womb, right? So that's what do we know about Job? What book of the Bible is Job? It's the first one, right? And so Job's the first book in the Bible. God says to Job that the sea break forth. And so the sea certainly broke forth during Noah's day, but it's very possible there was a breaking forth before Noah, right? And that's why the world was covered with water in the first place, and also why he makes the statement that he would stay the waves, right? But he says, when I made the cloud, the garment thereof, a thick darkness, a swaddling band for it. This is just what it sounds like to me. Maybe this is not what it is, right? This is just what it sounds like to me. Sounds like to me God's telling Job about the way that the world looked before he created. Right? What is he in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2? He tells you that the world was what? Without form and void, and what was upon the face of it? Darkness. And that's exactly what he describes right here, right? Darkness as a swaddling band. He wrapped darkness around the globe. Just what it sounds like to me. Not saying, I don't know. Anyways, so he says, and he break up break up it for my decreed place and set bars and doors. And he says he did what with that water that had broke forth that he then covered with this darkness and stuff. Then what did he do? Right? He says, did he break that water up? Right? He broke it up so that there would be a decreed place. It sounds like dry land to me. Maybe I'm wrong, but it sounds like dry land to me, right? And then he set bars and doors to hold the water back. And that's what he says in the last verse there. And hitherto, he says, shalt thou come, but no further. And there, here shall thy proud waves be stayed, right? You've been to the ocean? You've seen those waves, right, crash on the shore, right? There's no, what's holding them back? Science says it's gravitational pull of the earth. That's what science says it is, right? And I tend to agree with them. I think that's exactly what holds those waves back, keeps them from just overrunning entire cities, right, is the gravitational pull of the planet. Who put the gravitational pull in place? Well, God did, right? So we don't know how to create gravity. In fact, scientists will tell you this. If we could create gravity, if we could create our own gravity, that would be the greatest achievement in history. It would allow amazing things because gravity bends light. So if you could create your own gravity, you could create a vessel that you wouldn't be able to see because the light would bend around the gravity of the vessel. It would make you completely invisible, right? It's interesting stuff. I know I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to that kind of stuff, but but if you could create your own gravity, but gravity is what holds the ocean at bay. And every once in a while, we see a glimpse of what would happen if gravity were compromised when we see a tsunami. Right? That's a hint of what would happen if gravity is compromised. Because what is a tsunami? A tsunami is gravity being compromised, right, by basically an earthquake under the ocean. It compromises the gravity and sends a wave out. Right? You've all seen the tsunami in Japan, right? At least seen videos of it. That was absolutely devastating. I mean, it's insane. We've all been to, most of us have been, we live in Southern California, most of us have been at the beach and seen a rogue wave before. A wave that just was bigger than the other ones and just came out of nowhere. Nobody even saw it coming, right? And you watch people's lawn chairs and everything else get washed right out into the ocean, right? Listen, it happens, right? You get a glimpse of what might happen if gravity were compromised. All that God would have to do to destroy this world is turn the gravity switch off. And the world goes spinning out of control, man. It's important stuff. Anyways, day 4, he creates the sun, moon, and stars on day 4. That is verse 14 down through verse 19. God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth and to rule over the day and over the night and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and the evening and the morning were the 4th day. So God brings in these lights, right? Guess I should catch my slides up here. I've not been paying attention, I guess. Too enamored with the sound of my own voice. Let's see. There we go. So we've got the sun, moon, and stars. So God gives you the purpose, right, of the stars, the sun, moon, and stars. There's a purpose to them, right? He tells you that. In verse 14 and verse 15, he says they're going to do what? They're going to divide the day from the night. That's purpose number 1, right? But in dividing the day from the night, what is the outcome of dividing the day from the night? The outcome of dividing the day from the night is then they become signs, seasons, days, and years. Right? So God sets in place time. We know that in the beginning, right? That's time. Now that he has established time, now that he establishes this thing called a day, that turns into what? It turns into months and turns into years. These things now have the stars, sun, moon, and stars control the seasons, right? They're at least signs of the seasons, but they control the seasons. All of these things work together. Sometimes you will hear people make generalized statements, right? He says, but you'll hear people make some generalized statements, right, that will simplify creation, right? There's people who struggle with the concept of gravitation, right? Or they struggle with the concept of the world being a globe and these types of things, right? And a lot of times they simplify the world into something where, right, they take away the complexity of creation. Creation's much more complex than scientists even understand. We don't understand how the gravitational forces, right, the rotation of the earth and its placement on the axis, we don't understand how exactly all of that affects seasons, but we know it does. Right? And so, anyways, he says, and let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so. So God creates these things, right? He divides the day and the night. By dividing the day and the night, God, it creates this time capsule, right? That we now live in, right? Everybody knows there's how many hours in a day? 24, right? And so it creates that. And out of that is created also how many days there are in a year, right? Even though things are off kilter a little bit, right? Because we have to have what? We have to have leap year, right? To correct our calendar. So we're not precise, right? You say, well, God's not precise. Well, I think God was very precise. And then I think there was a flood. And I think there's a reason that we sit like this instead of like this. Right? So there's a lot of reasons for some of this stuff. But anyways, that is the sun, moon, and stars determine our calendar. Some people look to the sun, moon, and stars, right, for their horoscope and all this other stuff. And a lot of times we go, there's no reality in any of that stuff. It's all stupid. No, there's some reality in some of that stuff. So you better be careful about playing around with it, right? Because in Scripture, it's never seen as a positive, right? But that said, the sun, moon, and stars have a great effect on our planet, a greater effect than I think a lot of times that we understand. And then he says he gave them for signs. Let's go back to Job here real quick about signs here, right? And so, canst thou bind the sweet influence of Pleiades or loose the bands of Orion? You know what those are, right? They're constellations, right? Canst thou bring forth Mazzaroth in his season, or canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? Knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? Canst thou set the domination thereof in the earth? He says here, right? So the sun, moon, and stars, they're signs as well. They're signs of seasons. They're signs of all kinds of different things, right? But God tells Job what? Can you bring them forth whenever you want to? No, you can't. You know why? Because they're set in place for seasons and for days and for timing, right? They have an effect on all of this stuff. And where they're placed has an effect on all of the rest of our universe, and even our gravitational pull on the face of our planet is affected by the placement of stars and things during our seasons. So a lot of this stuff, like I said, right? It's basically a lot more complicated than we think it is. Psalms 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork, right? The sun, the moon, and the stars are signs of God's handiwork, right? So they're set in place for seasons, right? Prior to the flood, the temperature and such on the earth would have been much more consistent and constant, but there was still seasons. We know that because of what God tells Job, right? And so there certainly was seasons. They were discernible, right? And then, right, days, we've already talked about that, literal days. The sun is what enables years, right? If our rotation around the sun is what determines years, right? And I know that there are some who would say that the sun rotates around us, right? There's a lot of stuff out there, right? And I'm not a scientist. I'm not trying to be a scientist by any stretch of the imagination. But I know that there are some conflicting things about the concept of the sun rotating around the earth that would make it would set a collision course for a lot of other things with our planet. Right? It's also a very strange way to see things, even if from a theological perspective. But anyway, so all of that stuff, right? It delivers light to the earth, right? In fact, God talks about that twice here in the passage. Listen, the earth is absolutely the jewel of God's creation in the planet, right? And that is observed by the fact that of God's placement of the earth, right? We've had the discussion about the razor's edge, but a little bit closer to the sun, we all burn up. A little bit further, we'd all freeze. There's a lot of discussion to be had about that stuff. Here's what Sarfati has to say about creation. He said, God puts us in an optimal position, not at the outermost rim where the Milky Way would be dim, but far enough out to see clearly into the heights of the heavens. And so certainly that is true, right? God gives you the reason for the luminaries, right? Talks about the sun. The greater light is the sun. Sarfati says about the sun is by far the most massive object in our solar system, about 330,000 times larger than Earth. Its diameter of 1.4 million kilometers is 109 times that of the Earth and has 1.3 million times the Earth's volume and 330,000 times the mass. Its surface is 5,778 kilometers. That's 5,504 degrees Celsius, while its core is 14 million degrees Celsius. Right? Certainly the sun is, when God says the sun is the greater light and the moon is the lesser, right? He's not joking around, right? I don't know how you get greater than the sun, right? And so, listen, even the New Testament writers acknowledge the importance of creation in the life of us as believers, but just in the importance of creation in the revelation of truth. Right? Without creation, if you think that the world was just evolved or just popped into place, came out of nothing, right? You're starting from a place with no truth, right? No foundation for your truth at the very least. And so therefore, truth then becomes very subjective and is based very much on you and how you feel about things, right? And so creation is important in your life as a believer. We'll cut off there. We'll pick up there next week. And you are are there any questions, I guess, maybe or comments before we get out of here and we go have coffee and all that kind of fun stuff? I'll answer what I can. What I can't answer, I'll Google. Yeah. Yeah. They've had some interesting thoughts in the past about how our world is hung in space. But all right, make a run for it. There's coffee and stuff in the back, and we'll be back in here in about 10, 15 minutes.